In the summer of 1944, an eerie new sound droned over southern England. British air raid sirens wailed as a small, pilotless aircraft buzzed through the dawn sky. Londoners had learned to fear this noise, the sputtering buzz of Hitler's latest vengeance weapon, the V-1 flying bomb. With no pilot and packed with explosives, the V-1 rocket hurtled toward the city at 400 miles per hour. Its pulse jet engine emitted a harrowing rattle, earning it the nickname Buzz Bomb. Civilians on the ground listened in dread. As long as the V-1's engine roared, there was hope it might pass by. But suddenly the engine cut out. In that anxious instant of silence, bystanders braced themselves. Moments later, a thunderous boom rattled windows and sent a fireball into the air. Another London street had been obliterated. Across the Channel in occupied France, more of these sinister pilotless rockets were being launched from hidden sites, part of Hitler's desperate bid to terrorise Britain into submission. Conventional defences struggled to counter this new threat. Anti-aircraft gunners found it nearly impossible to hit a fast-moving small target like the V-1. RAF fighter pilots pushed their planes to the limit to chase the bombs, sometimes even tipping the V-1's wings to send it off course. Still, too many of the doodlebugs got through, slamming into British neighbourhoods and exacting a horrifying toll. By July 1944, the V-1 bombardment was in full swing, with hundreds of rockets raining down each week. The British nation, weary from years of war, now faced an unprecedented campaign of automated terror from the sky. Yet, even as these rockets descended, a glimmer of hope emerged from military laboratories and research bunkers. High above the English coast one morning, an Allied anti-aircraft battery opened fire on an approaching V-1. The gunners were armed with a new secret weapon, shells equipped with a proximity fuse, an ingenious device that would detonate the shell when it came close to its target. In a flash, one of these shells burst in the path of the oncoming buzz bomb. A fiery explosion tore the V-1 apart mid-flight, sparing the city below. Similar successes were mounting. To the public it seemed miraculous that gunners were suddenly hitting the elusive rockets. They could not know that the technology making it possible had been conceived years earlier by an unsung physicist working quietly behind the scenes. And the V-1 was not the only threat that this physicist's inventions countered. In the dark nights over Germany, Allied bombers once suffering grievous losses had begun to slip past enemy radars unseen. A mysterious cloud would appear on German radar screens, blobs of false echoes, while Allied aircraft vanished from detection. Puzzled German operators watched what looked like huge formations of aircraft, where none truly existed. Anti-aircraft guns and night fighters, once guided by precise radar, found themselves effectively blind. At the heart of both of these wartime miracles, shells that could automatically fell rockets from the sky and bombers cloaked from radar, was the work of one remarkable woman. Her name was Joan Curran, and her invention, dismissed by some as a mere chalkboard fix, a simple trick scrawled in calculations on a lab blackboard, would prove to be one of the war's great game-changers. Joan Curran's brainstorm was on its face almost laughably simple, thin strips of metal foil tossed out of aircraft. Yet this humble idea, born of sharp intellect and quiet determination, would save countless lives. It would shield Allied airmen from deadly radar-guided guns, confound Hitler's much-vaunted Wunderwaffe rockets, and help pave the way for Allied victory. This is the story of how a young Welsh physicist, working in the shadows of Britain's secret wartime laboratories, defied skeptics and tradition to devise a genius solution to the radar threat. It is a story of science and ingenuity pitted against the brutal technologies of war. It's about institutional resistance and the long path to acceptance for an idea that was ahead of its time. It's the tale of how Joan Curran's persistence and creativity fashioned a handful of foil strips into a weapon that altered the course of World War II. And it's a testament to quiet heroism, how a woman who never sought the spotlight nonetheless helped stop Hitler's deadliest rockets, and proved that sometimes the simplest ideas can have the most powerful impact. To understand the significance of Joan Curran's invention, we must step back to an aspect of World War II fought not with tanks or rifles, but with invisible radio waves. This was the secret war of radar, a cutting-edge technology of the 1940s that allowed militaries to see distant enemies using pulses of radio energy reflected from targets. In the war's early years, radar had already shown its formidable power. In 1940, Britain's chain of coastal radar stations had given the Royal Air Force precious minutes of warning during the Battle of Britain, allowing RAF pilots to intercept and repel Hitler's Luftwaffe. Radar had helped save Britain from invasion. But by the next phase of the war, radar was a double-edged sword. The Germans had developed their own radars and were using them to deadly effect. As British bombers began night attacks on Nazi Germany, they entered a shadowy arena illuminated only by moonlight and the probing beams of radar. German air defence generals, men like Josef Kammhuber, constructed an extensive radar-guided defensive system, known as the Kammhuber Line. Along this line, powerful ground radars named Freya and Würzburg scanned the skies for incoming RAF bombers. Once detected on radar, bombers could be tracked and targeted. Searchlights would lock on, anti-aircraft guns, or flak batteries, would zero in, and night fighter aircraft would be vectored to the bombers' positions. What had once been relatively haphazard night defences became frighteningly efficient. By 1941-42, RAF crews flying over occupied Europe knew that unseen eyes were watching them in the dark, guiding lethal defences their way. Allied losses began mounting. Aerial nights that had once offered some safety and darkness turned into deadly gauntlets. The Luftwaffe's radar-directed gun-laying flak and twin-engine night fighters took a heavy toll on British bomber squadrons. Entire crews failed to return from missions. Aircraft were being shot down with alarming precision in the black of night. The RAF dubbed this unseen menace the Scarecrow, after the decoy shells that mimicked exploding bombers, because sometimes all an airman saw was a distant flash before another bomber went missing. In truth, the real Scarecrow was German radar. It was clear that unless the RAF found a way to blind or confuse those electronic eyes, the strategic bombing campaign, a core part of the Allied effort to cripple Germany's war industry, might become unsustainable. This struggle against enemy radar became part of what Winston Churchill called the Wizard War, a battle of scientists and engineers on both sides racing to outwit each other's technology. In Britain, a select group of physicists and engineers were tasked with devising countermeasures to German radar, techniques to jam it, deceive it, or otherwise reduce its deadly effectiveness. They worked in utmost secrecy, for any hint of their efforts could lead the enemy to adapt. One such place was the Telecommunications Research Establishment, TRE, a secretive lab tucked away in the English countryside. Here, some of Britain's brightest minds toiled to answer a pressing question. How could the RAF bombers be rendered invisible to radar? By 1941, these scientists had developed active jammers, devices carried on bombers to send out radio noise and confuse German radars, with code names like Mandrel, Carpet, and Piperack. Each was designed to target specific German radar frequencies and muddle their signals. The jammers offered some relief, but they had limitations. They could not completely hide the presence of aircraft. At best, they limited the range or accuracy of radar locks. Moreover, the cat-and-mouse game continued as the Germans adjusted their systems in response. A more elegant solution was imagined by Britain's visionary scientific intelligence guru, Dr. R.V. Jones. He had suggested as early as 1937 that perhaps simple pieces of reflective material dropped in the air might create false echoes on radar. The idea was tantalizing. Instead of brute force jamming, one could trick the radar with a flood of fake signals. Over in Germany, unbeknownst to the British, similar musings were underway. German scientists realized that suspending metal foil or wire in the air could produce ghost signals on radar screens. Both sides were, in theory, aware that clouds of metallic chaff could blind radar. But theory is one thing. Making it a practical weapon and convincing the top brass to use it was another matter entirely. It would take a persistent and clever mind to turn this idea into reality and push it through wartime skepticism. That mind belonged to Joan Curran, though few would have predicted that a young Welshwoman would hold the key to defeating one of Germany's most advanced technologies. Joan Elizabeth Strothers, later Joan Curran, did not fit the typical image of a wartime weapons inventor. Born in February 1916 in Swansea, Wales, Joan grew up far from any centre of military research. Her father was an optician, her mother a homemaker. Joan's brilliance, however, quickly became evident. She excelled at Swansea Girls' High School, particularly in mathematics and physics, at a time when women in science were a rarity. In 1934, she earned a coveted scholarship to Newnham College, Cambridge, an extraordinary achievement for a young woman of her day. At Cambridge, Joan dove into the study of physics, a subject then almost entirely dominated by men. She also rowed competitively, representing the Ladies' University 8 in the first women's boat race against Oxford. That mix of intellectual rigour and athletic determination defined Joan's character. Those who knew her later recalled her scientific equivalent of gardening green fingers, meaning she had an uncanny talent for making experiments work. She was precise, dexterous, and innovative, qualities that would serve her and her country well in a few short years. Despite completing all the requirements with honours, Joan graduated in 1938 without receiving a full degree. The reason was simply institutional sexism. At that time, Cambridge did not award degrees to women, an outrageous policy that left Joan officially without a diploma despite her stellar performance. It was a stinging reminder of how the era's prejudices could sideline women's accomplishments. Undeterred, Joan secured a grant to pursue a higher degree and joined the university's famed Cavendish Laboratory. There she was assigned to work with a young physicist named Samuel Curran under the direction of Professor Philip Dee. Sam Curran was a bright Scottish scientist, and in the late 1930s he became first Joan's research partner and eventually something more. The two got along wonderfully, tinkering in the lab by day and sharing conversations about the latest theories in physics by night. A quiet camaraderie blossomed into romance. In Joan, Sam found an equal intellect and an adventurous spirit. In Sam, Joan found a collaborator who respected her abilities completely. Their academic pursuits, however, were soon upended by the march of history. On September 1st, 1939, while Joan and Sam were away on a research trip, Germany invaded Poland, igniting World War II. 2 days later, Britain declared war and everything changed. Joan and Sam, like many scientists of their generation, suddenly found their skills in urgent demand for the war effort. Instead of returning to Cambridge, Joan Struthers and her colleagues were whisked into government service. They first went to the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, and then to a makeshift lab in Exeter. In an old country house repurposed for secret research, Joan and Sam joined teams tackling various defence problems. Joan's first wartime assignment was as practical as it was daunting, developing a proximity fuse for anti-aircraft shells. At Exeter, while some of their peers worked on experimental rockets as anti-aircraft weapons, Joan and Sam applied themselves to this advanced fuse concept under physicist John Coles. The goal was revolutionary: a tiny radar set inside an artillery shell that could sense a target aircraft and detonate at just the right distance for maximum destruction. It was cutting-edge technology, essentially a miniature radio transmitter receiver that could survive being shot out of a gun. Joan's finesse in the laboratory proved invaluable. Together, she and Sam helped design a workable circuit for what they codenamed the VT, Variable Time Fuse. By 1940 they had a prototype, a small Doppler radar trigger that could fit in a shell's nose. This fuse would make shells far more lethal to aircraft. No direct hit needed, just a near approach. However, manufacturing such a device in large numbers was another challenge. Britain, under aerial siege in those years, lacked the production capacity to churn out millions of these high-tech fuses. Recognizing its potential, British leadership shared the VT fuse design with the United States in late 1940 as part of the TIZAD mission. The Americans, with their vast industrial might, refined and mass-produced the proximity fuse in secret. It would later be credited with dramatically improving Allied anti-aircraft defences, and indeed, these were the very fuses now bursting around Hitler's Vol 1 rockets in 1944, knocking them from the sky. Joan Curran's early work had come full circle to help save London from the vengeance weapons. Amid this intense scientific war work, Joan found time for personal life as well. In November 1940, in the middle of Britain's wartime upheaval, Joan Struthers married Sam Curran. She was 24, he was 28. Their wedding was a brief bright spot in dark times, held just before they transferred to a new assignment. Joan took her husband's surname, becoming Joan Curran, though in the lab and on secret documents her maiden name often persisted for security. The newlyweds soon packed up and moved again, this time to Telecommunications Research Establishment, TRE, Britain's premier radar research centre, which had been relocated to a safer location in Dorset, later Malvern, to escape the Blitz. At TRE, Sam joined a team developing centimetric radar for aircraft detection, while Joan stepped into the clandestine world of radar countermeasures. It was late 1940, and the Battle of Britain had given way to the Blitz and a global war. In the laboratories of TRE, Joan Curran was about to embark on the defining project of her career, one that would test both her ingenuity and her resolve. Upon arriving at TRE's sprawling facilities, Joan Curran entered a realm of secret projects and rapid-fire innovation. She joined the Countermeasures Group, led in part by the brilliant and eccentric R.V. Jones, whose mission was to devise ways to foil enemy radar. The problem was clear. Every night, RAF bombers flying over Europe were tracked by German radar and savaged by guided fighters and flak. How could the bombers disappear from those electronic scopes? British scientists had brainstormed various approaches, and Joan jumped into this brainstorming with enthusiasm. In a cluttered lab near the Dorset coast, Joan and her colleagues began trying all manner of experiments to confuse radar. They knew the basic physics. Radar works by sending out radio waves and listening for echoes. A large metal object, like an airplane, sends back a strong echo. But what if you could create other echoes to mask the real airplanes? Joan started experimenting with reflectors of different shapes and sizes. She tried long wires, cut to various lengths, hoping they'd resonate at enemy radar frequencies. She tried metal plates and even entire foil sheets, reasoning that a bigger reflective surface might give a big false return. At one point she had an inspired notion. What if the metal foil pieces could double as propaganda leaflets? She imagined large paper leaflets, perhaps the size of a notebook page, coated with reflective metal on one side and printed with Allied messages on the other. Dropped by the millions over Germany, these could both confuse enemy radar and deliver a psychological message. It was a clever idea, though as tests went on, the practical drawbacks became evident. The large papers didn't float well enough in the air to create a lasting radar distraction. Joan's lab soon became a workshop of scraps, snippings of wire, pieces of foil, paper, as she doggedly searched for the ideal design. Day after day, she tuned equipment and measured radar reflections off her test objects. Her notebook filled with columns of figures, frequencies, wavelengths, lengths of foil, signal strengths. And then, on one unremarkable afternoon, the breakthrough crystallized, likely scribbled on a chalkboard amid equations and sketches. Joan realized that the most effective shape was also a simple one. A thin strip of metal, cut to roughly half the wavelength of the enemy radar. German Würzburg gun-laying radars operated around 560 MHz, a wavelength of about 53 centimeters. Half of that was about 26.5 centimeters. In the elegant logic of physics, a conductor of half the radar's wavelength would resonate and re-radiate the radio waves brilliantly, giving a strong false echo. After iterative testing, Joan narrowed in on a final specification. Strips roughly 25 to 27 centimeters long and about 2 centimeters wide, made of lightweight material like paper backed with aluminum foil. They were light enough to flutter and float in the air for long distances, yet perfectly tuned to mimic a big aircraft on the radar screens. With excitement, Joan prepared a small bundle of these optimized strips. This was her eureka moment. Her chalkboard fix turned reality. The concept was simple enough to sketch in chalk. Tiny metal dipholes flooding the sky to create a radar smokescreen. But would it actually work in the field? Only a live trial could prove that. Joan Curran, meticulous as ever, took matters into her own hands. At home, using ordinary household scissors, she cut up pounds of aluminum foil into hundreds of strips of the specified length. She and a few colleagues then arranged a covert experiment with the RAF. One day, in early 1942, a lone British aircraft took off from the Christchurch airfield on England's south coast, carrying Joan's bundled packets of foil strips. As the plane flew out over the channel, the crew tossed the bundles out at intervals, allowing the foil to billow out and trail behind the aircraft. Meanwhile, back on land, operators at British radar stations eagerly watched their screens. What they saw astounded them. As the test plane released the material, blips blossomed across the radar display. To the radar, it looked as if an entire formation of aircraft had suddenly appeared, when in reality there was just one small plane. Joan's strips were miraculously effective. They created the illusion of dozens of targets, overwhelming the radar's ability to pick out the real plane. The radar observers reported that the effect was truly amazing, as one recalled. A giant ghost fleet on the screen where none existed. The first field demonstration of what had been codenamed Window was an unqualified success. For Joan, it was a triumphant validation of months of painstaking work. One can imagine her standing at the radar station, hearing the excited chatter of the operators as they lost the real target in a sea of false echoes. In that moment, the young physicist's little idea was no longer theory. It was a powerful new weapon in electronic warfare. She had proven that thin air filled with foil could baffle one of the Reich's most feared technologies. Joan's supervisor, the TRE superintendent A.P. Rowe, was suitably impressed. It was Rowe who gave the project its official codename Window, a suitably mundane term to cloak its real nature. As he quipped, it was as if the foil opened a window of blindness on the enemy radar. News of the successful trial spread among a tight-knit circle of British command. Here, at last, was a way to cloak bombers, or even create phantom fleets. There was elation among some in Bomber Command at the prospect of reducing their appalling losses. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Bomber Harris, who led RAF Bomber Command, was especially keen to get his squadrons equipped with the new device as soon as possible. Each bundle of window, weighing about 1 pound and containing hundreds of strips, could be tossed out of a bomber's flare chute every minute or so to create a continuous cloud of false echoes. Dozens of bombers doing this in concert could essentially make entire squadrons disappear behind a shimmering electronic veil. Harris immediately saw Window's potential to revolutionize the air war. Yet even as Joan Curran and her team celebrated their breakthrough, skepticism and fear hovered over the project's future. Some military and scientific authorities, upon hearing how Window worked, reacted with alarm rather than joy. To them, this fix seemed too simple, too easy for the enemy to copy. The concept of radar chaff was not exclusive to Britain, after all. What if using it against Germany prompted the Germans to retaliate in kind? There were voices at high levels of the British government who shuddered at that possibility. In early 1942, Window, radar chaff, sat on the cusp of deployment. Joan Curran and her colleagues had refined it, tested it, and even stockpiled a sufficient quantity for operations by the spring of 1942. All that remained was to give RAF aircrews the go-ahead to use this new countermeasure. But as the plan was presented to the British Chiefs of Staff, concerns were raised. Chief among the sceptics was Professor Frederick Lindemann, Winston Churchill's close scientific advisor, later Lord Cherwell. Lindemann understood perfectly well how Window worked, and that was exactly the problem. He pointed out in stark terms that the trick was so simple that if the RAF used it on the Germans, the Luftwaffe would quickly duplicate it and turn it against Britain. The scenario Lindemann painted was grim. Imagine German bombers returning to British skies, dumping clouds of foil over London. The RAF's own ground-based radar defences, crucial to intercepting enemy raids, would be blinded. It could usher in a second blitz with devastating effect. This prospect deeply worried Britain's fighter command and anti-aircraft command, the arms responsible for protecting the homeland. They had bitter memories of the 1940 Blitz, and were not eager to give the Germans any tool that could facilitate its return. As a result, these commanders suppressed the use of Window for the time being. In April 1942, the Chiefs of Staff did sanction the concept in principle, acknowledging that Joan's scheme was viable, but they effectively placed it under lock and key for emergency use only. To the scientists at TRE and the crews of Bomber Command, this was a frustrating and demoralising decision. Joan Curran's invention, which could save lives nightly, was being held back by what-ifs and worst-case scenarios. One can imagine Joan's dismay. Night after night, RAF bombers continued to go out without window protection, and many never returned. The spring of 1942 saw increasingly deep raids into Germany, Essen, Cologne, Bremen, with mounting losses from flak and night fighters. Each mission, in Joan's eyes, might have gone differently if only those foil strips were streaming out behind the planes. There are accounts that some RAF insiders bitterly joked about the situation. We have a solution gathering dust while our airmen are dying. But the order from above was unambiguous. Window remained classified and unused. Even mentioning its existence outside need-to-know circles was forbidden. The secret was so jealously guarded that Britain didn't even share it with its American allies at first, unlike the proximity fuse. For a full year after its readiness, Window would remain a curious laboratory success with no battlefield debut. Little did the British know that their caution was mirrored on the German side. In one of the war's many ironies, German scientists had independently come up with the same radar foil concept, which they called duple. They too realized early on that throwing out metallized strips could confuse radar. In fact, by 1942, the Luftwaffe had run tests with duple and found it effective. But when Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Göring considered using it, he recoiled at the very outcome Lindemann feared. Göring was reportedly terrified that if the British got wind of the duple trick, they would use it to catastrophic effect on German defences, so he forbade any mention or further development of duple. Thus, through mutual fear, a bizarre stalemate arose. Both sides possessed the key to blind the other's radar, yet both kept it sheathed, waiting for the other to flinch. For Joan Curran, the window of opportunity seemed shut by bureaucracy and worry. But war has a way of forcing hands. By 1943, the strategic situation had evolved. The Luftwaffe's ability to strike England had waned considerably since 1940. German bomber forces were depleted and mostly tied up on the Eastern Front. Meanwhile, the RAF's bomber offensive over Germany was becoming critical to Allied strategy, and it was bleeding. The Battle of the Ruhr in early 1943 saw German night defences at their zenith. RAF losses were approaching unsustainable levels, often exceeding 5% of aircraft on major raids. Morale among bomber crews was strained by the carnage. Each operation, dozens of brave young men went down in flames or were captured. By mid-1943, British leadership began to reconsider the gamble. The balance of risk had shifted. Allied scientists had by then developed newer centimetric radars with much shorter wavelengths for air defence, which they believed would be less vulnerable to chaff if the Germans tried retaliation. Moreover, the imperative to protect bomber command and ensure the success of forthcoming major operations, the planning for a cross-channel invasion was underway, grew stronger. Bomber Harris lobbied persistently for permission to use window. Finally, the thumbs up was given. After a year of sitting on the shelf, Joan Curran's invention was about to be unleashed. Before the big day, intensive preparations took place in utmost secrecy. In late June and early July 1943, select bomber crews were quietly trained in the use of window. In a closed briefing, a handful of astonished pilots and navigators were shown the small paper and foil strips and taught how to toss them through the flare chute at regular intervals using a stopwatch. They were sworn to secrecy. Most had no idea until then that such a device even existed. Special dispensers and chutes were improvised in the planes to make the job easier. The aircrew were told that this little chore during flight might well save their lives, and they believed it. The stage was set for Window's debut, and it would occur in a major offensive that would demonstrate its power to the world. In the last week of July 1943, Allied forces launched a blistering aerial assault on the German port city of Hamburg. Codenamed Operation Gomorrah, this campaign would later be remembered for its ferocious firestorm that engulfed the city. But it was also historic for another reason. It marked the first use of Joan Curran's radar countermeasure in full-scale combat. On the night of July 24th to 25th, as nearly 800 British bombers droned toward Hamburg, the Germans had no inkling that their formidable radar network was about to be rendered useless. The Pathfinder crews leading the bomber stream were the first to act. As they approached the coast of occupied Europe, just before enemy radar normally would have detected them, the Pathfinders began chucking window bundles out into the slipstream. Every minute, each crewman would grab a 1-pound bundle of foil strips and toss it through a chute. The bundles burst apart in the air, releasing thousands of glinting metallic ribbons into the night sky. Following behind, the main force bombers did the same, methodically disgorging packet after packet of chaff as they flew. On the ground, German radar operators in their darkened rooms stared at their cathode ray screens in confusion. Instead of the distinct moving blips of an incoming bomber formation, their screens blossomed into a wide, indistinct cloud of echoes. It was as if hundreds of aircraft were suddenly approaching everywhere. The radar plots were useless. There was no clear track to relay to the flak batteries and night fighters. A Würzburg radar guiding a searchlight or gun typically showed a sharp blip of a plane. Now it showed a whole curtain of noise. At command centres, officers shouted into phones trying to make sense of garbled reports. Were there 20 bombers coming? 200? Or was it a ruse? The master searchlights that should have caught the bombers in their beams began to wander aimlessly across the sky, finding nothing but empty air. Anti-aircraft guns, lacking radar locks, either held their fire or loosed random futile volleys well off target. In the air, German night fighter pilots scrambled to their usual patrol zones, only to discover that their onboard intercept radar, the Liechtenstein sets, were also swamped with false signals. Many roamed the sky blindly, never spotting a bomber. The RAF crews, peering down, could see the searchlights sweeping without focus and noted far less flak coming up than expected. It was uncanny, one pilot later remarked, noting how the German defences seemed paralysed. For once, the element of surprise was complete. Over Hamburg, the consequences were cataclysmic for the enemy. Freed from the usual gauntlet of flak and fighters, 791 bombers rained destruction, with unprecedented accuracy on the city below. High explosives crumped and flashed, and thousands of incendiaries set the city ablaze. A firestorm of almost biblical intensity erupted, devouring whole districts of Hamburg. Over several nights of attacks, more than 40,000 people, civilians and military, would perish in the inferno. It was one of the deadliest air raids in history, earning the moniker Germany's Hiroshima from some historians. German authorities were stunned. Hitler was reportedly furious that such devastation had been unleashed. From the Allied bomber crew's perspective, Operation Gomorrah was a stunning success and an immense relief. On the first night of Window's use, out of 791 bombers dispatched, only 12 aircraft were lost to enemy action. That's a loss rate of around 1.5%, far below the 5% or more that had become grimly routine. The foil strips had literally saved dozens of bombers and hundreds of airmen in one night alone. Squadron after squadron returned to base safely, many crews incredulous at how easy the raid felt compared to previous nightmares. There were cheers and perhaps a few tears of joy at debriefings when commanders revealed what had made the difference. Window had blinded the German radar. Pilots who months earlier might have privately scoffed at the idea of throwing tin foil out of their cockpits now were true believers. One bomber crewman likened Window to a protective angel, shrouding them from deadly eyes. German reactions in the aftermath were a mix of panic and admiring bewilderment. German civilians picked up the strange silver strips fluttering down from the sky, perplexed by their purpose. But German scientists knew immediately what they were. Duppel, the very same trick they had suppressed. Those fools, one can imagine a German radar technician saying about their own high command. The British are using it now. Indeed, the Germans were caught flat-footed by the sudden Allied deployment of chaff. For over a year, both sides had held a silent pact of abstention. The British had now decisively broken it. The results spoke for themselves. Window rendered the ground-controlled Himmelbett fighter guidance of the Kammhuber line virtually impotent that night. The carefully organised belts of radar stations simply could not function through the storm of false echoes. In the days following, Allied intelligence intercepted German reports calling the new countermeasure a real British coup and lamenting how it exposed a fatal vulnerability. The Luftwaffe rushed to adjust tactics. A savvy German night fighter ace, Hargo Hermann, had earlier been experimenting with wildboar tactics, sending fighters to find bombers by sight, using searchlight glows and burning cities for illumination. Now, with radar guidance crippled by Window, the Germans had no choice but to adopt these visual tactics more broadly. It was a partial workaround, but nowhere near as effective as radar control. In short, Joan Curran's little strips of foil had not only protected the bombers over Hamburg, they had forced the entire German air defence system into disarray and reinvention. Operation Gomorrah continued for nights, and each time the bombers used Window to confound the defence. By the end of the week, Hamburg was a smouldering ruin, and the German night air defence had suffered a psychological blow from which it never fully recovered. Bomber command crews, exhilarated by the dramatic drop in losses, now viewed Window as an indispensable part of their toolkit. Special dispensers were installed in many aircraft to make chaff deployment even easier. Other tactics were devised, like having small groups of bombers fly off to one side purely to drop extra Window, creating phantom formations to draw fighters away from the real strike. For Joan Curran, had she been able to publicly disclose her role, it would have been a moment of immense vindication. The chalkboard fix that some had once chuckled at had demonstrated its worth beyond doubt. What's more, the night skies over Germany were a little friendlier to Allied airmen because of her. The Chief of Bomber Command, Arthur Harris, exulted that now the enemy's devices, not our bombers, were at the mercy of the night, and R.V. Jones, with wry satisfaction, later noted that in his opinion, Joan Curran's contribution to victory exceeded that of many of her more celebrated male colleagues. The introduction of Window did have a flip side. It was now inevitable that the Germans would use chaff too. Sure enough, 6 weeks after Hamburg, the Luftwaffe finally employed Duppel during a raid on Italy in October 1943, and in some limited attacks on Britain in early 1944. But the feared German chaff blitz never materialised in any devastating form. By then, the Luftwaffe's offensive capability was a shadow of its former self, and Allied defences, including new microwave radars and plentiful night fighters, overwhelmed the small German raids even when chaff was used. The nightmare scenario that had delayed Window's use turned out to be far less dangerous than imagined. In hindsight, the year-long delay in using Window cost Bomber Command dearly in lives, a fact not lost on some historians. Nonetheless, once Window was in play, it dramatically levelled the field in the electronic war. The Allied air offensive gained a new lease on life, and it was about to get even more daring uses out of Joan's foil strips. With the Luftwaffe's radar eyes now vulnerable to deception, the Allies realised that Window could be employed not just defensively to protect bombers, but offensively to trick the enemy on a grand strategic scale. The most spectacular example came in June 1944, in the opening moves of the greatest amphibious invasion in history, D-Day. All through the spring of 1944, as Allied armies gathered in Britain to invade Nazi-occupied France, a massive deception campaign, Operation Bodyguard, strove to mislead the Germans about when and where the blow would fall. One key element of this was to convince German High Command that the invasion would land not in Normandy, the real target, but in the Pas-de-Calais area further northeast. The Allies deployed dummy tanks, fake radio traffic, double agents spreading false plans, and crucially, a radar deception using Joan Curran's invention on an unprecedented scale. On the night of June 5, 1944, even as paratroopers were en route to Normandy, an invasion ship slipped into the Channel. The RAF staged Operation Taxable and Operation Glimmer, two elaborate chaff-dropping missions intended to simulate invasion forces heading for Pas-de-Calais. Over the dark waters of the Channel, small groups of RAF bombers, notably from the famous No. 617 Dambusters Squadron, flew precise patterns, releasing carefully timed streams of Window. By adjusting their dropping interval and pattern, these squadrons created the radar illusion of two large fleets of ships crossing the Channel towards the French coast in exactly those areas the Germans suspected an invasion force might go. In addition to the chaff, the RAF dropped hundreds of dummy parachutists in the pre-dawn hours, far east of Normandy, to further confuse the enemy. These dummies, along with special forces units making commotion on the ground, mimicked an airborne assault in the Calais region, but it was the chaff that fooled the German coastal radars into seeing ghost convoys on the sea. One could imagine German operators in places like Cap d'Antifer and Boulogne suddenly detecting what looked like entire armadas where there were none. Urgent alerts would have raced up German command channels, enemy naval force approaching Calais, setting off panic and misallocation of reserves. The ruse worked brilliantly. The German 15th Army in the Pas-de-Calais, under General von Rundstedt's strategic command, remained convinced that the main invasion was yet to come at Calais, even after the real landings in Normandy had begun. For crucial days, in fact weeks, they held back significant panzer divisions and other forces, waiting for a blow that never arrived. Joan Curran's radar deception had effectively conjured a phantom invasion force that kept German commanders guessing and allowed the real Allied beachheads in Normandy to gain a foothold and build momentum. Historian accounts credit the use of Window on D-Day as a small but vital part of the overall deception that saved countless Allied lives by preventing additional German divisions from rushing to Normandy immediately. It's a remarkable thought. The same foil strips that had shielded bombers over Hamburg were now helping win a beachhead on Fortress Europe. Joan Curran, of course, wasn't in the planes dropping chaff nor on the ships landing at Normandy, but her hand was invisibly present in the success of that operation. One might say that in the skies over the Channel that night, Joan's ghost fleet sailed strong. Shortly after D-Day, Hitler at last unleashed the long-feared V1 flying bombs in large numbers against London and other cities. By mid-June 1944, these missiles were arriving daily, but Britain was far from defenceless, thanks in part to technology Joan had helped set in motion years before. As mentioned, the proximity fuses she had worked on were now standard in Allied anti-aircraft batteries ringing London. Initially, V1s proved hard to shoot down, but once the new fuses were rushed to AA gun units, the hit rate climbed dramatically. By August 1944, British gunners were destroying the majority of V1s that reached the coastal defence belt. The great vengeance weapon blitz was blunted, though not without tragic losses of life from the ones that got through. The radar countermeasures side of the fight against V1s also had a twist. Allied electronic wizards attempted various jamming techniques on the V1's simple guidance, its gyroscopic autopilot and altimeter. There is some evidence they used dipping radar beams and perhaps even dropped chaff to confuse German radar tracking of the V1 impacts, so the enemy couldn't easily calibrate their aim. But compared to the elegant solution of proximity fuses and fighter interceptions, those played a lesser role. Still, indirectly, Joan Curran's contribution stopped Hitler's rockets. Her work on the VT fuse ensured many V1s were detonated harmlessly in mid-air, and her chaff helped safeguard the very bombers and invasion forces that knocked out the launch sites on the ground. By September 1944, Allied armies had overrun the V1 launch zones in northern France, silencing the threat to London at its source. The rockets had been stopped, not by some flashy new superweapon, but by a combination of scientific ingenuity and the courage of those implementing it, much of which traced back to the unassuming woman from Wales with a knack for solving impossible problems. After the triumphant application of her inventions in 1944, Joan Curran continued to serve the Allied cause in another secret domain. In early 1944, she and her husband Sam were invited to join the British mission to the top-secret Manhattan Project in the United States. The Currans moved to Berkeley, California, where Sam worked on developing the revolutionary scintillation counter, a device for detecting radiation, and Joan assisted in efforts related to electromagnetic separation of uranium for the atomic bomb. Even as she contributed to the dawn of the nuclear age, Joan remained characteristically modest and focused on the task at hand. In 1945, with the war won, the Currans returned to Britain and settled into academic life. Sam became a renowned professor, later knighted for his scientific contributions. Joan, however, slipped into relative obscurity, her wartime achievements largely unheralded in public. For decades, the full story of Window remained classified and little known outside military circles. The men who led the organisations, R.V. Jones, A.P. Rowe, Arthur Harris, received much of the credit in official histories. Joan Curran's name was rarely mentioned. This was not surprising in the mid-20th century. Many women's contributions to the war were minimised or forgotten in the post-war narratives. Joan herself never sought the limelight. She moved to Glasgow with Sam, raised a family and redirected her energies to charitable work, particularly founding organisations to support parents of mentally handicapped children, inspired by her own first child's disability. By all accounts, she approached these efforts with the same determination and compassion that marked her scientific work. It wasn't until much later in life that Joan Curran received any form of formal recognition for her wartime ingenuity. In 1987, at the age of 71, she was awarded an honorary doctorate from the University of Strathclyde, a nod both to her scientific accomplishments and perhaps a quiet rectification of Cambridge's old injustice of not awarding her degree back in 1938. Around the same time as the World War II archives gradually opened, Joan's pivotal role in inventing radar chaff began to surface in books and articles. Colleagues and historians started to acknowledge that without Joan, there might have been no Window, or at least not in time to make the difference it did. R.V. Jones, that keen judge of intelligence and innovation, paid Joan Curran the highest compliment in his memoirs. "In my opinion," he wrote, "Joan Curran made an even greater contribution to Allied victory than her husband Sam." Jones was not one for idle praise. He had witnessed firsthand how Joan's green fingers in the lab and relentless experimentation produced the tool that blinded German radar and protected thousands of lives. Considering Sam Curran helped invent the proximity fuse and later the scintillation counter, Jones's statement underscores just how significant Window was to the war's outcome. Finally, in her later years, Joan saw a few tributes. A building here, a fund there, even a summer house named in her honour. When she passed away in 1999 at age 82, obituaries lauded her as the woman whose invention helped win a war, a recognition that had been a long time coming. The Independent's obituary highlighted how her radar foil idea, long overlooked, was crucial in the air war and noted her uncanny scientific talent. To this day, every time a modern military aircraft deploys chaff to dodge a guided missile, it's using the same principle Joan Curran pioneered. Those flimsy strips of metallized material might seem low-tech in an age of stealth bombers and digital warfare, but they endure because they work, a testament to the elegance of the original idea. In fact, in an almost comical turn of events, clouds of military chaff occasionally confuse weather radar operators in the present day, appearing as mysterious storms on meteorologists' screens. Over 70 years later, Joan's invention can still sow a little harmless chaos, baffling weathermen just as it once baffled German air defence. Joan Curran's story is one of quiet brilliance and perseverance. She operated in a realm where women were often patronised or underestimated. She doesn't belong, some said of women in the laboratory or the command post. But Joan didn't need to raise her voice or pound the table to make her mark. Instead, she let the results speak. Each bomber that returned home safe, each V1 brought down before it could kill, each German commander fooled into holding back reserves. These were the unspoken accolades of her work. How many lives were saved by those slender strips of foil? It's impossible to know precisely, but certainly thousands of airmen who made it back to base, and perhaps untold thousands of civilians spared the wrath of weapons that never struck their targets. In the end, the chalkboard fix that was once met with skepticism and even derision proved to be a stroke of strategic genius. Joan Curran, sketching equations on a blackboard and cutting foil at her kitchen table, had changed the course of World War II. The forces of institutional hesitation nearly stymied her, but truth has a way of emerging when it's most needed. When Window and the technology it enabled finally had their day, the doubters were silenced by the roar of RAF bombers safely passing through enemy skies and the silence of Hitler's rockets falling short of their mark. Joan's life is a reminder that heroes of war are not only found in the trenches or cockpits, but also in quiet lab corners and late-night drafting rooms. As we reflect on her legacy, picture that young woman in 1941, standing before a chalkboard filled with waveforms and calculations, a scrap of tinfoil in hand, telling a room of dubious men how this little strip of metal could save lives. They may have mocked her then. They certainly didn't by 1945. Joan Curran's story is now carved into the annals of military history, a story of insight, resilience, and ultimately vindication. It teaches us that sometimes the most profound revolutions in warfare begin not with roaring cannons or flashy rockets, but with a bright mind, a piece of chalk, and an idea that nobody believes, until it changes the world. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favour, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people who care about the heroes who got forgotten. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing these stories from dusty archives and obscurity every single week. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching.